The severed head of Khalil Hassan, the most wanted terrorist leader in the Middle East, hit the briefing room table with a wet thud that silenced every voice in the Pentagon's most secure conference room. Major Jessica Crawford stood at attention, her black tactical gear still caked with desert sand and dried blood, as senior military officials stared in stunned disbelief at the trophy she delivered after completing what everyone had considered an impossible suicide mission. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 48 hours earlier, those same officials had written Crawford off as dead, another casualty of an operation so dangerous that volunteering for it was considered tantamount to signing your own death warrant. The mission parameters were simple in their brutality. Infiltrate Hassan's compound deep in hostile territory, eliminate the target, and extract with proof of death. What made it suicidal wasn't the infiltration or even the assassination. It was the extraction from a fortress surrounded by 300 heavily armed militants who would stop at nothing to protect their leader. But as Hassan's lifeless eyes stared up at the men who had condemned Crawford to certain death, it became clear that they had fundamentally misunderstood who they were dealing with. The woman standing before them wasn't just another special forces operator who had gotten lucky. She was something far more dangerous. A soldier who had spent her entire life proving that other people's definitions of impossible meant nothing when measured against her own determination to succeed. Jessica Marie Crawford had been fighting uphill battles since the day she was born in a rundown neighborhood of Detroit, Michigan, where survival wasn't guaranteed, and success was measured by how far you could distance yourself from the circumstances of your birth. Her father, Michael Crawford, had been a factory worker whose drinking problem had cost him 3 jobs before Jessica turned 10. Her mother, Linda, worked double shifts as a nursing assistant to keep food on the table and the electricity turned on, leaving Jessica to raise herself in an environment where weakness was exploited and strength was the only currency that mattered. The Crawford family lived in a 2-bedroom apartment where the heat never worked properly and the sound of sirens was as common as alarm clocks. Jessica learned early that the world divided people into 2 categories, those who fought for what they wanted and those who accepted what they were given. By the time she was 12, she had already decided which category she belonged to, though the path to that realization had been marked by experiences that would have broken most children. The first time Jessica truly understood what it meant to fight for survival, she was 8 years old and walking home from school through a neighborhood where elementary students learned to navigate gang territories with the same care that other children used to cross streets. A group of older boys had cornered her in an alley behind the local grocery store, demanding the lunch money she'd saved for 3 weeks to buy her mother a birthday present. Instead of handing over the crumpled bills, Jessica had picked up a broken piece of concrete and swung it at the closest boy's head with enough force to send him stumbling backward into his friends. The beating that followed had left her with a black eye and bruised ribs, but she'd kept her money and learned something valuable about the relationship between violence and respect. The older boys never bothered her again, and word spread through the neighborhood that the Crawford girl wasn't an easy target. More importantly, Jessica discovered that the fear she'd felt before the confrontation was nothing compared to the satisfaction of refusing to be victimized. Her mother had been horrified when Jessica came home with her face swollen and her school clothes torn, but her father's reaction had been different. Michael Crawford might have been a drunk, but he'd grown up in the same neighborhood and understood the economics of survival that his daughter was learning. After examining Jessica's injuries and hearing her explanation, he'd taken her to the basement of their apartment building and taught her how to throw a proper punch. "Jessie," he'd said, wrapping her small hands in torn pieces of an old t-shirt, before showing her how to hit the heavy bag he'd suspended from the ceiling pipes. "The world's going to try to knock you down every day for the rest of your life. You can let it happen, or you can learn to hit back harder than it hits you. But once you start fighting, you better be prepared to keep fighting until you win." The makeshift gym in the basement became Jessica's sanctuary and her training ground. Every afternoon after school, she'd spend hours working on the heavy bag, developing the kind of punching power that seemed impossible for someone her size. Her father, during his sober moments, proved to be an surprisingly effective trainer who understood the psychology of combat as well as its physical demands. He taught her that size and strength were less important than speed, timing, and the willingness to absorb punishment in order to deliver it. By the time Jessica entered high school, she had developed a reputation that preceded her through the hallways of Martin Luther King Jr. High school where academic achievement was secondary to the more immediate concerns of avoiding pregnancy, drug addiction, and violent crime. She was known as someone who didn't start fights but always finished them, a distinction that earned her a grudging respect from students and teachers, who understood that survival skills were often more valuable than academic credentials. Jessica's first formal introduction to organized violence came during her sophomore year when Coach Patricia Thompson, a former Marine who had taken a teaching job after completing her military service, noticed Jessica's natural athleticism and aggressive temperament during a mandatory physical education class. Thompson had been running an informal boxing program for students who needed an outlet for the anger and frustration that characterized adolescence in an urban environment where opportunities were scarce and violence was common. Crawford, Thompson had said after watching Jessica dominate a sparring session against a boy who outweighed her by 40 pounds, "You've got natural instincts, but you're fighting like a street brawler. If you want to learn how to really hurt people, you need to understand technique." The distinction between street fighting and organized combat became the foundation of Jessica's transformation from an angry teenager into a disciplined warrior. Thompson taught her that violence could be controlled, channeled, and applied with precision, rather than simply unleashed in moments of desperation. More importantly, she learned that the mental aspects of combat were as important as the physical skills, requiring discipline, planning, and the ability to remain calm under pressure. The boxing gym where Thompson trained serious fighters was located in a converted warehouse that smelled of sweat, leather, and the kind of desperation that drove people to seek glory through violence. Jessica felt at home immediately among the collection of amateurs and professionals who gathered each evening to practice a sport that rewarded aggression while demanding absolute technical precision. The other fighters initially dismissed her as another teenage girl who would lose interest as soon as she experienced real pain. But Jessica's persistence and natural ability quickly earned their respect. Her first amateur fight came 3 months after she began training seriously, against a girl from Flint who had 12 previous victories and a reputation for ending fights early. Jessica's preparation had been intense, involving daily training sessions that pushed her physical conditioning beyond anything she'd experienced during her years of basement workouts. Thompson had been brutally honest about the challenges Jessica would face against a more experienced opponent, but she'd also recognized something in her student that went beyond technical skill or physical capability. Crawford, Thompson had said the night before the fight, "Your opponent has more experience and probably better technique, but she's never had to fight for anything that really mattered. You've been fighting for survival your whole life. Don't forget that when you're in there." The fight itself had been a revelation that changed Jessica's understanding of her own capabilities. Her opponent's technical superiority was evident in the first round. But Jessica's relentless pressure and willingness to absorb punishment in order to deliver it gradually wore down the more experienced fighter. By the third round, Jessica's conditioning and mental toughness had created opportunities that she exploited with combinations that surprised even her own trainer. The knockout punch that ended the fight was thrown with a precision and power that announced the arrival of a serious prospect in the local boxing community. The victory had been intoxicating, but more importantly, it had validated Jessica's belief that determination could overcome superior skill when applied with sufficient intensity. The recognition that followed her amateur success opened doors to training opportunities and competitions that she'd never imagined possible, but it also created expectations that demanded even greater commitment to the sport that was becoming the center of her life. Over the following 2 years, Jessica compiled an amateur record that caught the attention of college recruiters and professional promoters, who saw in her the kind of marketable combination of skill and aggression that could translate into commercial success. But Jessica's goals extended beyond the boxing ring. Influenced by Coach Thompson's stories about military service and the opportunities available to people who were willing to commit themselves to something larger than personal achievement. The decision to join the military, rather than pursue professional boxing, had been influenced by a conversation with her father during one of his increasingly rare periods of sobriety. Michael Crawford had been watching his daughter's fights with a pride that was complicated by his own sense of failure as a provider and role model. He understood that Jessica's success in boxing represented an escape from the neighborhood that had trapped him, but he also recognized that his daughter possessed qualities that could be applied to pursuits more meaningful than entertainment. "Jessie," he'd said after watching her win the state amateur championship, "you've got something special, something that goes beyond just being good at hitting people. You could make money fighting, but you could also do something that matters. The choice is yours, but don't waste what you've been given on something small." The conversation had crystallized thoughts that Jessica had been developing about her future and her responsibility to use her abilities in service of goals that extended beyond personal success. The military represented an opportunity to apply her fighting skills in contexts that mattered, while also providing the kind of structure and purpose that she'd been seeking since childhood. Her decision to enlist had surprised Coach Thompson, who had been planning Jessica's transition to professional boxing, but who also understood the appeal of military service for someone who had spent her life fighting individual battles without being part of something larger than herself. Thompson's own military experience had taught her that the skills developed in combat sports translated effectively to military training, but that the reverse was also true. Military discipline and tactical thinking could enhance athletic performance in ways that purely civilian training could not achieve. The night before Jessica left for basic training, her father had given her a piece of advice that would influence every decision she made during her military career. "Remember," he'd said, "you're not just representing yourself anymore. You're representing everyone who believed you could do something special. Don't let them down, and don't let yourself down." Quote. Basic training at Fort Benning had been Jessica's introduction to a world where her background as a street fighter and amateur boxer was just one qualification among many that would be tested and refined. The physical demands were significant but manageable for someone who had spent years conditioning her body for competitive violence. More challenging were the psychological adjustments required to function effectively within a military hierarchy that demanded absolute obedience, while also rewarding individual initiative. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Her drill instructors had initially been skeptical of Jessica's potential, viewing her urban background and aggressive temperament as potential discipline problems rather than assets that could be developed. But Jessica's performance during training exercises had gradually changed their assessment, particularly her ability to remain calm under pressure and her willingness to accept responsibility for mission success rather than individual survival. The moment that defined Jessica's transition from civilian to soldier came during a combat simulation that tested trainees' ability to function under stress while making tactical decisions that affected their entire unit. Jessica had been assigned to lead a squad through a scenario that required coordinating fire and movement while under simulated enemy attack, a responsibility that demanded the kind of leadership skills that couldn't be taught through classroom instruction. When the exercise began, Jessica's squad had immediately come under heavy fire that scattered them across difficult terrain. 2 of her soldiers had been designated as casualties, creating a tactical problem that required balancing the need to complete the mission against the imperative to care for wounded personnel. Jessica's decision to split her remaining forces, with half providing covering fire while she personally carried the wounded to safety, had demonstrated the kind of tactical thinking and personal courage that her instructors recognized as exceptional. Crawford, Drill Sergeant Davis, had said after the exercise, "That was the kind of leadership we're looking for. You made decisions under pressure, took personal risks to accomplish the mission, and never lost sight of your responsibility to your people. That's what separates soldiers from civilians." The recognition had been gratifying, but more importantly, it had confirmed Jessica's belief that her abilities extended beyond individual combat skills to include the kind of tactical thinking and leadership qualities that the military valued most highly. The transition from street fighter to soldier was complete, but Jessica's real education was just beginning. Jessica's first deployment to Afghanistan came 18 months after completing basic training, following advanced infantry training and specialized courses that had identified her as someone with exceptional potential for high-risk operations. The 75th Ranger Regiment had recruited her based on performance evaluations that highlighted her ability to function under extreme stress while maintaining tactical awareness that exceeded expectations for someone with her limited military experience. What her commanding officers didn't fully understand was that Jessica's capacity for violence and decision-making under pressure had been developed long before she'd ever worn a uniform. Forward Operating Base Blackwater sat in the Korangal Valley, a stretch of mountainous terrain that had earned the nickname Valley of Death for the frequency and intensity of Taliban attacks against American forces. The base itself was a collection of prefabricated buildings surrounded by concrete barriers and razor wire, designed more for survival than comfort. Jessica's first impression of the place was that it felt like a prison where the inmates had weapons, and the guards were trying to kill everyone inside. Her new unit, Bravo Company of the 2nd Battalion, consisted of soldiers who had already completed multiple deployments and who viewed new arrivals with the skepticism reserved for people who might get them killed through inexperience or cowardice. Jessica understood that she would need to prove herself quickly in an environment where trust was earned through competence under fire, and where mistakes had consequences that extended far beyond individual failure. Staff Sergeant Marcus Williams, her team leader, had been fighting in Afghanistan for 3 years and had survived encounters that had killed or wounded dozens of other soldiers. His assessment of new personnel was based on a simple calculation: would they be assets or liabilities when bullets started flying? Williams had seen too many promising soldiers collapse under the pressure of actual combat to be impressed by training scores or physical fitness evaluations. "Crawford," Williams had said during Jessica's first briefing, "I don't care what you did in training or how tough you think you are. Out here, the only thing that matters is whether you can kill the enemy before they kill you and your teammates. Everything else is just conversation." Quote. The Korengal Valley presented tactical challenges that were unlike anything Jessica had encountered during training. The terrain consisted of steep mountains covered with dense vegetation that provided excellent concealment for insurgents who knew the area intimately and who could appear anywhere without warning. American forces were essentially trapped in a series of outposts connected by roads that were constantly under observation by Taliban fighters, who controlled the high ground and who had unlimited time to plan ambushes. Jessica's first combat experience came during her second week at FOB Blackwater, when her squad was assigned to escort a convoy carrying supplies to a remote outpost that had been under siege for 6 days. The mission briefing had been routine, describing a standard transportation run through territory that was considered relatively secure. But Jessica had learned during her childhood in Detroit that assumptions about safety were often the prelude to violence, and she'd prepared for the mission with the same intensity she'd once brought to boxing matches. The convoy consisted of 4 armored vehicles carrying supplies and personnel, moving through a narrow mountain pass that provided multiple opportunities for ambush. Jessica rode in the lead vehicle, scanning the ridgelines for movement while maintaining radio contact with overhead surveillance aircraft that were monitoring the route for signs of enemy activity. The landscape was beautiful, in a harsh way, all rocky peaks and deep valleys that looked like they'd been carved by violence rather than erosion. The attack came at exactly the moment when the convoy was most vulnerable, as they navigated a hairpin turn that forced the vehicles to slow down while exposing them to fire from multiple directions. The first indication of trouble was the distinctive whistle of incoming rocket-propelled grenades, followed immediately by the machine gun fire that turned the peaceful mountain morning into a killing zone designed to destroy the entire convoy. Jessica's vehicle took a direct hit from an RPG that disabled the engine and killed the driver instantly, filling the passenger compartment with smoke and the smell of burning diesel fuel. The impact had thrown Jessica against the vehicle's armored wall hard enough to leave her dazed but still functional, while the gunner was screaming that he couldn't see to return fire effectively. Outside, the sound of automatic weapons indicated that the other vehicles were engaged in a firefight that would determine whether anyone made it home alive. "Everybody out," Williams shouted over the radio static and weapons fire. "Take cover behind the vehicles and establish fields of fire. Crawford, you're with me. We're going to clear the ridge to our east." Jessica's transition from passenger to combatant was immediate and instinctive, drawing on reflexes that had been developed through years of violent confrontation rather than military training. She grabbed her rifle and extra ammunition while scanning the terrain for enemy positions, automatically calculating angles of attack and potential escape routes. The fear she'd expected to feel was replaced by the familiar cold focus that had carried her through dozens of boxing matches and street fights. The climb up the rocky slope toward the Taliban positions was conducted under constant fire from fighters who were trying to pin down the American soldiers, while additional insurgents moved to surround the convoy. Jessica and Williams moved in bounds, with one providing covering fire while the other advanced, using rocks and sparse vegetation as concealment. The physical demands of the climb were significant, but Jessica's conditioning allowed her to maintain the pace while carrying full combat equipment. Halfway up the slope, Williams was hit in the leg by sniper fire that sent him tumbling behind a boulder where he lay cursing and trying to stop the bleeding. Jessica found herself alone, 50 meters from enemy positions, with the choice of retreating to help her wounded team leader or continuing the assault that might break up the ambush before it destroyed the convoy. The decision required the kind of tactical thinking under pressure that couldn't be taught in any training program. "Williams, how bad are you?" Jessica called over the noise of gunfire that was intensifying as more Taliban fighters joined the battle. "I can move, but not fast enough to keep up," Williams replied, his voice strained but controlled. "You need to take out that machine gun position before they get the angle to destroy the vehicles." Jessica's assault on the Taliban position was conducted with the kind of aggressive tactics that her boxing background had taught her. Close the distance quickly, hit hard, and don't stop until the fight is over. She used covering fire from Williams and the convoy to move within grenade range of the enemy position, then eliminated the machine gun crew with a combination of rifle fire and hand grenades that silenced their weapons permanently. The success of Jessica's solo assault had broken the ambush and allowed the convoy to continue its mission, but more importantly, it had established her reputation as someone who could be counted on when situations became desperate. Williams, despite his wound, had been impressed by Jessica's tactical decision-making and her willingness to take risks that most soldiers would have avoided. "Crawford," he'd said as medics treated his leg wound back at the base, "that was some aggressive soldiering. You've got instincts that can't be taught, but you also took intelligent risks. That's the kind of thinking that keeps people alive out here." Over the following months, Jessica participated in operations that tested every aspect of her military training, while also drawing on the street fighting skills that had shaped her character before she'd ever worn a uniform. Each mission presented unique challenges that required adapting tactics to terrain, enemy capabilities, and mission objectives that often changed without warning. Jessica discovered that her ability to remain calm under pressure and make quick decisions was as valuable as her marksmanship or physical conditioning. Her reputation within the unit grew as she consistently demonstrated competence during operations that pushed soldiers beyond their training and into situations where survival depended on individual initiative and teamwork. Jessica's background as a boxer had taught her to absorb punishment while continuing to fight effectively, a quality that proved invaluable during extended firefights where lesser soldiers might have been overwhelmed by the intensity of combat. The mission that transformed Jessica from a competent soldier into someone marked for special operations came during her 6th month in the country, when intelligence identified a high-value target operating from a compound deep in Taliban-controlled territory. The target was Ahmed Nazir, a bomb maker whose improvised explosive devices had killed dozens of American soldiers and who was believed to be planning a major attack against coalition forces. Captain David Reynolds, the company commander, had been tasked with capturing or killing Nazir, but the mission presented tactical challenges that exceeded the capabilities of conventional infantry tactics. The compound was heavily fortified and defended by experienced fighters who would fight to the death rather than allow their leader to be captured. More problematically, the compound was located in terrain that made traditional assault approaches suicidal. "This is going to require someone who can operate independently behind enemy lines," Reynolds had explained during the mission briefing. "We need a volunteer for a reconnaissance mission that will provide intelligence for the main assault. I'm not going to lie to you. This is extremely dangerous, and there's a good chance whoever goes won't make it back." Jessica's decision to volunteer was immediate and instinctive, driven by the same competitive instincts that had motivated her boxing career and her entire approach to military service. She understood that the mission would test her abilities beyond anything she'd experienced, but she also recognized it as an opportunity to prove that her capabilities extended beyond conventional infantry operations. The reconnaissance mission required Jessica to infiltrate enemy territory alone, observe Nazir's compound for 72 hours, and gather intelligence about defenses, personnel, and daily routines that would allow the main assault force to plan an effective attack. She would be operating without support, carrying only the equipment she could transport on foot, and relying entirely on her own skills for survival and mission success. Her preparation for the mission was more intensive than anything she'd undertaken during her military career. Jessica studied satellite photographs of the target area, memorized terrain features and potential escape routes, and rehearsed emergency procedures for situations ranging from equipment failure to capture by enemy forces. She also selected weapons and equipment based on requirements for stealth, reliability, and versatility rather than maximum firepower. The infiltration itself required Jessica to move 15 kilometers through hostile territory during darkness, avoiding Taliban patrols while navigating terrain that was unfamiliar and potentially mined. Her approach to the compound was conducted with the patience and precision that her boxing training had taught her. Study the opponent, identify weaknesses, and execute with perfect timing. The observation post Jessica established provided excellent visibility of the compound while offering concealment from enemy patrols. For 3 days and nights, she documented the movement patterns of guards, identified defensive positions, and counted personnel while surviving on minimal food and water. The intelligence she gathered revealed that Nazir's security was more sophisticated than initial assessments had indicated, with overlapping fields of fire and redundant communication systems that would make any assault extremely costly. On the second night of her surveillance, Jessica witnessed something that changed the entire nature of the mission. Nazir wasn't just a bomb maker operating from a defended compound. He was the regional Taliban commander responsible for coordinating attacks across multiple provinces, and his compound served as a headquarters for operations that extended far beyond improvised explosive devices. The intelligence Jessica was gathering had implications that reached far beyond a single capture mission. More significantly, Jessica observed a pattern in the compound security that suggested an opportunity for something far more ambitious than reconnaissance. The guards' shift changes created a brief window of vulnerability that could be exploited by someone with the right skills and sufficient audacity. Instead of simply gathering intelligence for others to act upon, Jessica began planning an operation that would eliminate Nazir personally. The decision to expand her mission from reconnaissance to assassination was one that Jessica made without authorization, based on tactical opportunities that hadn't existed when the original mission was planned. She understood that attempting to kill Nazir alone would violate her orders and put her at enormous personal risk, but she also recognized that the opportunity might not present itself again. Her assault on the compound was conducted with the same aggressive tactics that had characterized her entire military career, but refined by months of combat experience and tactical education. Jessica eliminated the sentries during their shift change, penetrated the compound's defenses, and located Nazir's quarters without alerting the other defenders. The confrontation with the Taliban commander was brief and decisive, ending with Nazir's death and Jessica's escape before the alarm could be raised. The intelligence and proof of death that Jessica brought back from her solo mission established her as someone with capabilities that extended far beyond conventional military operations. Captain Reynolds and his superiors recognized that Jessica possessed a combination of tactical skills, physical ability, and psychological makeup that made her suitable for the most demanding special operations missions. "Crawford," Reynolds had said during her debrief, "what you accomplished out there was extraordinary. You completed a reconnaissance mission, identified strategic intelligence, and eliminated a high-value target without any support or backup. That's the kind of performance that gets noticed at levels far above my pay grade." The recognition that followed Jessica's successful solo mission opened doors to training opportunities and assignments that were reserved for the military's most elite personnel. But more importantly, it had proven to Jessica herself that her capabilities extended beyond anything she'd previously imagined, setting the stage for challenges that would test the absolute limits of her abilities. The invitation to attend Delta Force selection arrived 6 weeks after Jessica's successful solo elimination of Ahmed Nazir, delivered by a colonel who introduced himself only as Johnson, and who spoke with the kind of authority that suggested he operated far outside normal military channels. The meeting took place in a windowless room at Bagram Airfield, where Jessica had been summoned without explanation, and where she found herself facing the most intense scrutiny of her military career. "Sergeant Crawford," Colonel Johnson had begun, reviewing a file that seemed impossibly thick for someone with Jessica's limited service time. "Your performance in the Korangal Valley has attracted attention from people who specialize in operations that don't officially exist. We're looking for individuals who can operate independently in situations where failure means death, and success requires capabilities that go beyond conventional military training." Quote, "The Delta Force Assessment and Selection course was conducted at a classified location in the mountains of North Carolina, where candidates were subjected to physical and psychological testing designed to identify the small percentage of military personnel capable of the most demanding special operations missions." Jessica arrived knowing that fewer than 10% of candidates successfully completed the course, and that those who failed were returned to their units with no explanation of what they had attempted. The other candidates represented the elite of the American military, Navy SEALs, Army Rangers, Marine Force Recon, and Air Force Special Operations personnel, who had already proven themselves in combat. Jessica was one of only 3 women in a group of 47 candidates, and the only one who had been selected based on a single operation rather than years of distinguished service. The scrutiny from her fellow candidates was immediate and skeptical. "Crawford," said Chief Petty Officer Ryan Matthews, a SEAL with multiple deployments and a reputation for brutal honesty, "I've heard about your little adventure in Afghanistan. Impressive work, but selection is different from combat. This is about mental toughness as much as tactical skills. The mountains will break you down in ways that enemy fire never could." The first phase of selection focused on individual physical and mental endurance, with candidates subjected to forced marches carrying increasingly heavy loads across terrain that seemed designed to destroy equipment and shatter resolve. Jessica's background as a boxer had prepared her for physical punishment, but the mountain environment presented challenges that required adaptation and learning, rather than simply enduring pain. The weight of her rucksack increased daily, from 40 pounds to 60, then 80, and finally to loads that exceeded her body weight. The marches were conducted regardless of weather, across terrain that included swamps, rocky peaks, and dense forests where navigation required constant attention to map and compass. Jessica discovered that her competitive instincts, which had served her well in boxing and infantry operations, needed to be controlled during selection where the only competition was with the standards rather than other candidates. Master Sergeant Patricia Hayes, one of the selection cadre, had been observing Jessica's performance with the clinical detachment of someone who had seen hundreds of candidates attempt the course. Hayes was a 20-year veteran of special operations who had participated in classified missions across multiple theaters, and her assessment of candidate potential was considered definitive by the Delta Force community. "Crawford," Hayes had said after Jessica completed a particularly brutal navigation exercise, "you're pushing yourself too hard. Selection isn't about proving you're tougher than everyone else. It's about demonstrating that you can maintain performance under stress for extended periods. Slow down and focus on consistency rather than heroics." The advice was counterintuitive for someone whose entire life had been built around outworking and outfighting opposition, but Jessica gradually understood that special operations required a different kind of mental approach. The ability to maintain steady performance over days or weeks was more valuable than spectacular achievement followed by collapse. She learned to pace herself, to conserve energy, and to focus on the long-term objectives rather than immediate challenges. The psychological testing was more challenging than the physical demands, involving scenarios designed to assess decision-making under extreme stress and the ability to function when information was incomplete or deliberately misleading. Jessica was placed in situations where she had to choose between competing priorities, where the correct answer was ambiguous, and where failure carried consequences that extended beyond personal performance. During one exercise, Jessica was given command of a simulated hostage rescue mission, where intelligence reports contradicted each other, and where every tactical option involved unacceptable risks. The scenario was designed to test her ability to make decisions when perfect information was unavailable, and when hesitation could result in casualties among both hostages and rescue personnel. "You have 4 minutes to develop a plan and begin execution," the evaluator had announced. "The hostages are being held in a building that may or may not be rigged with explosives. The terrorists may or may not be prepared to execute their captives. Your team may or may not have the capabilities required for this mission. What are your orders?" Quote, Jessica's response was based on principles she'd learned during street fights and boxing matches. When information is limited, create opportunities through aggressive action rather than waiting for perfect intelligence. She developed a multi-phase plan that gathered information through initial contact while maintaining the flexibility to adapt based on enemy response. Her willingness to accept calculated risks while maintaining focus on mission objectives impressed evaluators who had seen other candidates paralyzed by uncertainty. The leadership evaluation phase required candidates to take command of teams attempting operations where success depended on coordinating individual efforts toward collective objectives. Jessica was assigned responsibility for a team attempting to navigate a complex obstacle course while carrying simulated casualties and operating under time constraints that made careful planning impossible. Her team consisted of candidates who had been strangers before selection and who were competing against each other for limited positions in Delta Force. Creating effective teamwork under these circumstances required leadership skills that went beyond giving orders or demonstrating personal competence. Jessica had to inspire cooperation among people who had no reason to trust her and every reason to focus on their own performance. "Listen up," Jessica had told her team before beginning the exercise. Every one of us is here because we're good at what we do individually. But this exercise isn't about individual performance. It's about proving we can work together when mission success depends on collective effort. If anyone fails, we all fail. If we succeed, we all succeed. The obstacle course itself was designed to require capabilities that no individual possessed, forcing team members to support each other in ways that revealed character under pressure. Jessica's approach was to assign roles based on individual strengths while ensuring that everyone understood how their contribution related to overall mission success. Her team completed the course faster than any other group, but more importantly, they did so without compromising the simulated casualties who represented the ultimate measure of mission success. The final phase of selection took place during winter conditions that added environmental challenges to every aspect of the evaluation process. Candidates were required to demonstrate proficiency in cold weather operations, survival techniques, and mission execution when equipment failure and extreme weather could compromise any aspect of the operation. Jessica's Detroit background had prepared her for cold weather, but operating in mountain conditions during winter required adaptation and learning. The culminating exercise was a solo navigation mission that required candidates to reach a series of checkpoints across 50 miles of mountain terrain while carrying full equipment and operating under time constraints that allowed no margin for error. The mission was conducted during a blizzard that limited visibility to a few yards and that made compass navigation essential for survival as well as mission success. Jessica's approach to the navigation exercise drew on everything she'd learned during selection about pacing, planning, and mental resilience. She moved steadily rather than quickly, checked her position constantly, and maintained focus on immediate objectives rather than being overwhelmed by the distance remaining. When equipment problems threatened to compromise her mission, she improvised solutions rather than accepting failure. 12 hours into the navigation exercise, Jessica's compass malfunctioned in conditions where electronic navigation was prohibited and where getting lost could be fatal. Instead of panicking or attempting to continue without reliable direction finding, she used terrain association and celestial navigation techniques to maintain her bearing toward the next checkpoint. The improvisation required confidence in her abilities and willingness to trust her judgment when normal procedures were inadequate. The blizzard intensified during Jessica's final approach to the last checkpoint, creating conditions where visibility was measured in feet rather than yards, and where hypothermia became a serious threat to anyone who slowed down or stopped moving. Jessica's physical conditioning and mental preparation allowed her to maintain the pace necessary for survival while navigating terrain that would have been challenging under optimal conditions. When Jessica reached the final checkpoint, she found that only 7 other candidates had successfully completed the navigation exercise within the time limit. The other 39 had either failed to reach the objective, violated safety protocols, or demonstrated deficiencies that eliminated them from further consideration. Jessica was among the small group who had proven they possessed the physical and mental capabilities required for Delta Force operations. Colonel Johnson, who had recruited Jessica for selection, was present for the final evaluation where successful candidates learned whether they would be invited to join Delta Force or return to their previous units. His assessment was based on comprehensive evaluation of performance across all phases of selection, but also on intangible qualities that distinguished exceptional operators from merely competent soldiers. Sergeant Crawford, Johnson had said during Jessica's individual debrief, "Your performance during selection was exceptional, but more importantly, you demonstrated the kind of adaptability and mental toughness that characterizes our most effective operators. You're being invited to join Delta Force, but you need to understand that selection was just the beginning. The real training starts now." The invitation to join Delta Force was the culmination of everything Jessica had worked towards since enlisting, but it also represented the beginning of a new phase of her military career, where the standards and expectations would exceed anything she'd previously experienced. The girl from Detroit who had learned to fight on the streets had become a soldier, and the soldier had become something even more specialized and dangerous. Her new assignment came with access to training opportunities, equipment, and missions that existed at the absolute pinnacle of military operations. But more significantly, it came with the understanding that Jessica would be expected to operate in situations where conventional military capabilities were inadequate, and where success would depend on the kind of individual excellence that could only be developed through years of the most demanding preparation. The transition from candidate to operator began immediately, with Jessica assigned to a training program that would prepare her for missions that required capabilities far beyond anything covered during selection. She would learn advanced demolitions, foreign languages, sophisticated surveillance techniques, and specialized weapon systems that were unavailable to conventional forces. More importantly, she would learn to operate in environments where discovery meant death, and where mission failure could have strategic consequences. As Jessica prepared for the next phase of her training, she reflected on the journey that had brought her from the boxing gyms of Detroit to the most elite unit in the American military. Every challenge she'd faced, every fight she'd won, and every limitation she'd overcome had been preparation for opportunities that she'd never imagined possible. The girl who had learned to survive on the streets had become someone capable of thriving in the most dangerous environments on Earth. Jessica's first assignment as a Delta Force operator came 18 months after completing selection, following advanced training that had transformed her from an exceptional soldier into something far more dangerous and versatile. The mission briefing took place in a secure facility buried beneath the Pentagon, where she found herself facing intelligence officials whose names she would never learn and whose existence was officially denied by the United States government. The target was Viktor Kozlov, a former Russian intelligence officer who had gone rogue and was selling nuclear weapon specifications to terrorist organizations across the Middle East. Kozlov operated from a fortified compound in the mountains of Georgia, where he was protected by a private army of mercenaries, and where conventional military operations were impossible due to political sensitivities surrounding Russian involvement in the region. "This is a black operation," explained Deputy Director Sarah Martinez of an agency that wasn't identified during the briefing. "Kozlov has information that could result in nuclear terrorism on American soil. He's also smart enough to know that his life depends on staying ahead of everyone who wants him dead. The Russians want him eliminated for betraying state secrets. Multiple terrorist organizations want him dead to prevent competitors from acquiring his information. And we want him eliminated because he represents an existential threat to national security." The operational parameters were unlike anything Jessica had encountered during her military career. She would be inserted into Georgia using civilian cover, operating without official support or backup, and with instructions to eliminate Kozlov, while making his death appear to be the result of internal conflicts among his mercenary forces. If captured, she would be disavowed by the American government and left to face consequences that would likely include torture and execution. Jessica's preparation for the mission required learning skills that went far beyond conventional military training. She studied Kozlov's background, memorized his daily routines, and learned enough Russian to operate convincingly in an environment where any mistake could expose her identity. She also received training in specialized weapons and explosives that would leave forensic signatures consistent with mercenary conflicts rather than American military operations. The insertion into Georgia was conducted through a series of commercial flights and ground transportation that established Jessica's cover as a freelance journalist investigating human rights violations in the Caucasus region. Her cover identity was supported by months of carefully constructed background information, including published articles and social media presence that would withstand scrutiny from intelligence services that might investigate her presence in the region. Kozlov's compound was located in a remote valley, accessible only by a single mountain road that was continuously monitored by security cameras and patrolled by armed guards. The facility itself consisted of multiple buildings surrounded by electrified fencing and defensive positions that made direct assault impossible for anything short of a major military operation. Jessica's reconnaissance revealed that Kozlov had created a fortress that reflected both his paranoia and his understanding of the threats he faced. The security arrangements were sophisticated enough to defeat conventional infiltration techniques, requiring Jessica to develop an approach that exploited human psychology rather than relying on stealth or overwhelming force. Her plan centered on the mercenaries' assumption that threats would come from outside the compound rather than from someone who had already gained access through legitimate means. Jessica's initial approach was to establish contact with the compound's supply network, identifying vulnerabilities in the logistical arrangements that supported Kozlov's operation. The compound required regular deliveries of food, fuel, and equipment that created opportunities for infiltration by someone with the right credentials and sufficient patience to build trust gradually over time. Her cover as a journalist provided the perfect excuse to investigate the region while making contact with local officials and business people who might have connections to Kozlov's operation. Jessica spent 3 weeks building relationships and gathering intelligence before identifying her entry point, a medical supply company that provided pharmaceutical products to the compound's clinic. The approach required Jessica to convince the supply company's owner that she was investigating pharmaceutical distribution in conflict zones, while simultaneously gathering information about delivery schedules and security procedures. Her background as a boxer proved useful in establishing credibility with people who respected toughness and who were suspicious of outsiders who seemed too clean or professional. American journalist asked Dmitry Volkov, the supply company owner, studying Jessica with the careful attention of someone who had survived decades in a region where trust was often fatal. "You don't look like the other journalists who come here. They're all soft, scared of everything. You look like you can take care of yourself." Jessica's response drew on her Detroit background and her understanding of how to earn respect from people who valued strength over credentials. "I grew up in a place where you learned to fight or you didn't survive. I'm here to tell stories that matter, not to hide behind hotel security while writing about things I don't understand." The relationship that developed between Jessica and Volkov provided access to information about the compound's security measures and daily routines that would have been impossible to obtain through surveillance alone. Volkov had been delivering supplies to the compound for 2 years and had developed insights into Kozlov's operation that were invaluable for planning an infiltration. "Kozlov is smart, but he's also arrogant," Volkov explained during one of their conversations. "He thinks money and mercenaries make him untouchable. But everyone who works for him knows that he's paranoid about poison, about infiltrators, about betrayal from his own people. That fear makes him predictable." Jessica's infiltration of the compound was conducted during a routine medical supply delivery, hidden among pharmaceutical shipments that were inspected but not thoroughly searched by security personnel who had processed similar deliveries hundreds of times. Her concealment required remaining motionless for 6 hours in a modified shipping container that barely provided enough space for breathing, let alone movement. Once inside the compound, Jessica had to navigate security systems and patrol schedules while remaining undetected for the 36 hours required to complete her mission. The compound's layout was more complex than reconnaissance had indicated, with underground tunnels and hidden rooms that served as escape routes and defensive positions. Jessica's movement required patience and careful timing to avoid encounters with security personnel who would instantly recognize her as an intruder. Her location of Kozlov required accessing his personal quarters in the compound's most secure building, where he was protected by electronic surveillance systems and a rotating guard detail that never left him alone for more than a few minutes. Jessica's approach required disabling security systems without triggering alarms, while creating opportunities to isolate Kozlov from his protection detail. The technical challenge of bypassing the compound security was solved using specialized equipment that Jessica had carried concealed in her supply shipment infiltration. Electronic warfare devices allowed her to create temporary malfunctions in surveillance systems, while monitoring equipment let her track guard movements throughout the facility. Her penetration of the secure building was conducted during a shift change that created a brief window of reduced vigilance. Kozlov's elimination was accomplished using a poison that mimicked the symptoms of a heart attack, administered through his evening vodka during a brief moment when his bodyguards were distracted by a maintenance issue that Jessica had created in the compound's electrical system. The method was chosen to suggest natural causes while avoiding the kind of obvious assassination that would trigger intensive investigation of security procedures. The extraction from the compound required Jessica to remain hidden for 12 hours while emergency personnel responded to Kozlov's death and while security forces conducted searches to determine whether his death was the result of assassination or natural causes. Jessica's concealment in a maintenance area provided protection from cursory searches while allowing her to monitor radio communications that revealed the compound's response to the crisis. The initial confusion following Kozlov's death created the perfect cover for Jessica's escape, as security personnel focused on protecting information and assets, rather than pursuing potential infiltrators who might already have left the area. Jessica's exit from the compound was accomplished during the chaos of personnel evacuation and document destruction that followed confirmation of Kozlov's death. Her extraction from Georgia required reverting to her journalist cover while avoiding intelligence services that were investigating Kozlov's death, and that might have identified her presence in the region as suspicious. Jessica's departure was conducted through the same commercial transportation network that had brought her to the country, but with additional precautions designed to prevent surveillance by foreign intelligence services. The successful completion of the Kozlov mission established Jessica's reputation within the special operations community as someone capable of the most demanding solo operations. The mission had required technical skills, psychological manipulation, physical endurance, and tactical thinking that exceeded the capabilities of most special operations personnel. More importantly, it had demonstrated Jessica's ability to operate independently in environments where discovery meant death and where mission failure could have strategic consequences. Colonel Johnson's debrief following the mission was conducted in the same secure facility where Jessica had received her initial briefing, but his assessment reflected recognition that she had exceeded expectations even for Delta Force operations. The successful elimination of Kozlov, without detection or political consequences, had prevented nuclear information from reaching terrorist organizations while avoiding the international complications that would have resulted from conventional military action. Crawford Johnson had said, "What you accomplished in Georgia represents the gold standard for black operations. You infiltrated a hardened target, eliminated a high-value asset, and extracted without leaving any evidence of American involvement. That's the kind of capability that makes the difference between successful foreign policy and international disasters." The recognition that followed the Kozlov mission opened doors to assignments that existed at the highest levels of national security operations. Jessica was invited to brief senior policymakers on special operations capabilities and to consult on missions that required the kind of individual excellence that she had demonstrated. Her transition from soldier to strategic asset was complete, but it also positioned her for challenges that would test the absolute limits of her abilities. The mission that would define Jessica's career and establish her legend was already being planned in the classified meeting rooms, where America's most sensitive operations were authorized. The target would be more dangerous than Kozlov, the location more challenging than Georgia, and the political stakes higher than anything she had previously encountered. But Jessica had proven that she possessed the capabilities required for missions that others considered impossible, setting the stage for the operation that would either establish her as the most effective operator in American special operations or result in her death in circumstances that would never be officially acknowledged. The secure conference room at CIA headquarters in Langley fell silent as the intelligence analyst finished her briefing on Khalil Hassan, the terrorist leader whose elimination had become the Pentagon's highest priority. Jessica sat at the polished mahogany table surrounded by officials whose combined authority could authorize military actions across the globe, but whose expressions revealed the frustration of people confronting a problem that conventional capabilities couldn't solve. Hassan isn't just another terrorist leader, Director of National Intelligence Robert Chen explained, his voice carrying the weight of classified assessments that painted an increasingly dire picture. He's a former Iraqi intelligence officer who survived the fall of Baghdad and spent 15 years building a network that combines sophisticated operational security with unprecedented access to weapons of mass destruction. Our sources indicate he's planning something that could make 9/11 look like a minor incident. The photograph spread across the briefing table showed a compound that defied every principle of military assault operations. Hassan's fortress occupied a mountain plateau accessible only by a single road that switchbacked up sheer cliffs for 12 miles, with every turn covered by interlocking fields of fire from positions that would require weeks of sustained bombardment to neutralize. The compound itself was built into the mountain, with underground facilities that extended deep enough to survive direct nuclear strikes. General Patricia Hayes, now commanding Joint Special Operations Command, outlined the tactical impossibility that had stymied military planners for 8 months. "We've run every conceivable assault scenario through our best tactical computers. Conventional forces would need a division-sized element just to reach the compound, and they'd take 70% casualties before engaging the primary defenses. Airborne assault is impossible due to the elevation in weather patterns. Even our most optimistic projections show mission failure rates above 90%. Jessica studied the intelligence materials with the analytical mindset that had been developed through years of impossible missions, automatically identifying choke points, defensive advantages, and the kind of tactical challenges that made conventional approaches suicidal. But she also recognized something that the briefing materials hadn't emphasized. Hassan's compound wasn't just defensive. It was a trap designed to lure American forces into exactly the kind of frontal assault that would result in massive casualties and strategic defeat. What makes this a Delta Force problem instead of a strategic bombing target? Jessica asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer from the expressions around the table. CIA Deputy Director Martinez leaned forward with the intensity of someone delivering information that would change everything. Hassan has 12 American hostages, including 2 cabinet-level officials who were captured during a diplomatic mission that went wrong. He's also sitting on top of a chemical weapons cache that could contaminate groundwater supplies for 3 major cities if it's released through bombing or conventional assault. We need surgical precision, not overwhelming force. The mission parameters that emerged from the briefing represented everything that military planners were trained to avoid: a hardened target defended by overwhelming force, civilian hostages whose survival was essential, weapons of mass destruction that couldn't be damaged during the operation, and political stakes that made failure unacceptable. It was exactly the kind of mission that Jessica had been preparing for throughout her entire military career, though she'd never imagined confronting challenges of this magnitude. Colonel Johnson, who had become Jessica's primary handler for black operations, outlined the specific requirements that made this mission different from anything previously attempted. This isn't about infiltration or assassination. We need Hassan eliminated, the hostages rescued alive, and the chemical weapons secured without environmental release. You'd be operating alone against 300 enemy fighters in terrain that favors defense. It's not just difficult, it's impossible. Jessica's response was immediate and instinctive, drawing on competitive instincts that had driven her since childhood and that had been refined through years of succeeding where others failed. Impossible is just another word for something that hasn't been done yet. What kind of support would I have? The support package outlined during the remainder of the briefing was unprecedented for a solo operation: satellite intelligence updated in real time, specialized equipment designed specifically for this mission, and extraction assets positioned to respond within minutes of mission completion. But the fundamental challenge remained unchanged: one operator against overwhelming odds in terrain designed to prevent exactly the kind of operation that success required. Jessica's preparation for the Hassan mission consumed 3 months of intensive training that pushed her capabilities beyond anything she'd previously experienced. The compound's layout was recreated using classified construction techniques that replicated every detail of Hassan's fortress, allowing Jessica to rehearse approaches, infiltration routes, and extraction procedures until they became instinctive. She memorized guard rotations, studied architectural drawings, and learned the personal habits of key personnel, including Hassan himself. The technical challenges were addressed through equipment modifications that pushed the boundaries of available technology. Jessica's weapons were customized for the specific requirements of urban combat in confined spaces. Her communications gear was upgraded to function reliably in the electromagnetic interference that Hassan's defensive systems created, and her protective equipment was designed to provide maximum mobility while offering protection against chemical weapons exposure. The psychological preparation was equally intensive, involving scenario-based training that forced Jessica to make tactical decisions under conditions that simulated the stress and uncertainty of actual operations. She practiced hostage rescue procedures while under fire, rehearsed chemical weapons containment protocols while fighting for her life, and learned to operate effectively when normal tactical support was unavailable. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the military psychologist assigned to assess Jessica's readiness for the mission, conducted evaluations that went far beyond standard psychological screening. Mitchell's assessment needed to determine whether Jessica possessed the mental resilience required for an operation where the psychological pressure would exceed anything previously documented in special operations literature. Crawford, Mitchell had said during one of their sessions, "This mission will test you in ways that no training can fully prepare you for. You'll be alone against overwhelming odds, responsible for civilian lives, and operating in an environment where any mistake could result in mass casualties. Are you certain you're prepared for that level of responsibility?" Jessica's answer drew on everything she'd learned about herself during years of progressively more challenging operations. "I've been preparing for this my entire life. Every fight I've been in, every mission I've completed, every limitation I've overcome, has been training for something like this. I'm not saying it will be easy, but I am saying I can do it." The final mission briefing took place 48 hours before insertion, with Jessica receiving intelligence updates that revealed Hassan's compound was on high alert due to increased American surveillance activity. The window for operation was closing rapidly as Hassan was preparing to relocate his operation to an even more secure location, where rescue of the hostages would be impossible. "You have a 72-hour window," General Hayes explained during the final briefing. "Hassan is scheduled to transport the hostages to a new location, and our intelligence suggests that timeline coincides with a planned chemical weapons test, that could kill thousands of civilians. This is our last opportunity to prevent a catastrophe. Quote, Jessica's insertion into hostile territory was conducted using a high-altitude, low-opening parachute drop that placed her 15 miles from Hassan's compound during a moonless night that provided maximum concealment. Her approach to the target required crossing terrain that was continuously monitored by surveillance systems and patrolled by forces that would shoot any intruder on sight. The 12-mile climb to Hassan's compound was conducted over 26 hours, moving only during periods when weather and patrol schedules provided brief windows of opportunity. Jessica's progress was measured in hundreds of yards rather than miles, requiring patience and discipline that exceeded anything she'd experienced during previous operations. Every step was calculated to avoid detection by sensors that could trigger responses ranging from sniper fire to aerial bombardment. As Jessica reached the final approach to Hassan's fortress, she reflected on the journey that had brought her from the boxing gyms of Detroit to the most dangerous mission in special operations history. Every challenge she'd faced, every victory she'd achieved, and every skill she'd developed had been preparation for an operation that would either establish her as the most capable operator in American military history or result in her death in circumstances that would never be officially acknowledged. The compound loomed above her in the pre-dawn darkness, a monument to paranoia and violence that represented everything she'd spent her career fighting against. But Jessica had learned that the most formidable obstacles were often vulnerable to approaches that others considered impossible, and she was about to prove that determination and skill could overcome any defense when applied with sufficient intelligence and courage. The infiltration of Hassan's compound began at 0347 hours when Jessica slipped past the final perimeter sensor, her heart rate controlled, despite the knowledge that she was now inside a fortress designed to kill anyone who attempted exactly what she was doing. The compound's outer defenses had taken her 6 hours to navigate, moving through detection grids that would have been impossible to breach without the specialized equipment and perfect timing that months of preparation had provided. The interior layout matched her memorized blueprints perfectly, but the reality of moving through corridors where discovery meant immediate death created psychological pressure that no training could fully replicate. Every footstep was calculated to avoid pressure plates embedded in the floors, every turn was preceded by careful surveillance for roving patrols, and every breath was controlled to minimize sound in an environment where silence meant survival. Hassan's fortress was more sophisticated than intelligence reports had indicated. The underground levels extended deeper into the mountain than architectural surveys had revealed, with redundant communication systems and backup power supplies that ensured continued operation even under sustained attack. Jessica's route to the hostage-holding area required descending 4 levels through passages that were monitored by thermal sensors and defended by automated systems that could seal entire sections of the compound. The first hostages Jessica located were being held in a converted storage room that had been modified to serve as a maximum security detention facility. Through a ventilation grate, she observed 6 Americans, including Deputy Secretary of State Jennifer Walsh, whose capture had triggered the highest-level crisis response in the current administration. The hostages showed signs of prolonged captivity, but appeared to be in relatively good health, suggesting Hassan was maintaining them as valuable bargaining chips rather than subjects for immediate execution. The challenge was accessing the detention area without triggering alarms that would alert the entire compound to her presence. Jessica's approach required disabling electronic locks while bypassing motion sensors that were calibrated to detect even minor movement in the corridor outside the holding cell. Her specialized equipment allowed her to create electromagnetic interference that temporarily disabled surveillance systems, while her lockpicking skills, developed during years of covert operations, provided silent entry to areas that should have been impregnable. "Who are you?" Deputy Secretary Walsh whispered as Jessica entered the cell, her voice barely audible but carrying the authority of someone accustomed to command even under the most desperate circumstances. "United States military," Jessica replied, her voice equally quiet but filled with the confidence that had carried her through dozens of impossible situations. "I'm here to get you out, but I need you to follow my instructions exactly. We have one chance to do this right." The extraction of 6 hostages from a facility designed to prevent exactly that operation required Jessica to split her attention between immediate tactical requirements and long-term mission objectives. She couldn't simply evacuate the hostages and consider the mission complete. Hassan's elimination and the chemical weapons containment were equally critical objectives that would require her to continue operating alone, after ensuring the hostages reached safety. Jessica's solution was to guide the hostages to a predetermined extraction point, where Special Operations Forces were positioned to provide immediate evacuation, while she continued deeper into the compound to complete the primary mission. The hostage movement required perfect timing to coincide with guard shift changes and electronic surveillance maintenance windows that created brief periods of reduced security coverage. "Ma'am," Jessica explained to Deputy Secretary Walsh as they prepared to move, "I'm going to take you to people who will get you home safely. But I have to stay here to finish something that's more important than any of our individual survival. Your country needs Hassan eliminated, and those chemical weapons secured, and I'm the only one who can do it." The hostage extraction proceeded flawlessly, with Jessica's tactical planning and the hostages' discipline combining to move 6 people through hostile territory without detection. The handoff to extraction forces occurred at the compound's vehicle maintenance facility, where Jessica's colleagues were positioned to provide immediate escort to safety. But Jessica's most dangerous challenges lay ahead as she prepared to penetrate the compound's most secure areas. Hassan's personal quarters were located in the deepest part of the underground complex, protected by security measures that exceeded anything Jessica had encountered during her career. Access required passing through multiple checkpoints manned by Hassan's most trusted lieutenants, navigating passages that were monitored by overlapping surveillance systems, and reaching a target who never moved without bodyguards who would die to protect him. The chemical weapons storage facility was located adjacent to Hassan's quarters, a deliberate choice that ensured any assault on his position would risk triggering the environmental catastrophe that made conventional military operations impossible. Jessica's approach to both objectives required sequencing her actions to eliminate Hassan while simultaneously preventing accidental release of chemical agents that could contaminate the entire region. Her infiltration of the secure levels required skills that represented the culmination of everything she'd learned during years of special operations training. Electronic warfare techniques allowed her to create blind spots in surveillance coverage, while her understanding of human psychology enabled her to exploit the overconfidence of guards who believed their position was impregnable. Jessica's movement through the compound's most secure areas was conducted with the patience and precision of someone who understood that haste would result in failure and death. The confrontation with Hassan occurred in his private office, where Jessica found the terrorist leader reviewing intelligence reports while planning the attack that would have made him the most successful terrorist in history. Hassan's reaction to her sudden appearance revealed both his tactical awareness and his understanding that her presence meant his security had been comprehensively defeated. "So," Hassan said in accented English, his hand moving slowly toward a weapon while his eyes assessed Jessica's capabilities, "the Americans finally send someone competent. But you're alone, which means you're here to die. My death won't save those cities from what's coming." Jessica's response was immediate and decisive, drawing on combat reflexes that had been honed through years of life-and-death encounters. "Your death saves everyone from what you're planning. And I'm not here to die. I'm here to take your head back to people who've been waiting a long time to see it." The fight that followed was brief but incredibly violent, with Hassan proving to be more formidable than intelligence assessments had indicated. His background as an intelligence officer had included extensive combat training, and his years of surviving assassination attempts had taught him to fight with the desperation of someone who understood that capture meant torture and execution. But Jessica's combination of boxing skills, military training, and combat experience provided advantages that Hassan couldn't overcome. Hassan's elimination was accomplished using methods that ensured his death would be immediate and unambiguous, providing the proof that mission planners required while also satisfying Jessica's personal commitment to ending the threat he represented. The decapitation was conducted with surgical precision using combat knives that were designed for exactly this purpose, though the psychological impact of the act was something that Jessica would carry with her for the rest of her life. The chemical weapons containment operation required Jessica to implement procedures that had been developed specifically for this mission, using specialized equipment to neutralize agents that could have killed thousands of civilians if released through conventional demolition. Her technical training allowed her to identify the most dangerous components while implementing safety protocols that prevented accidental exposure during the neutralization process. The extraction from Hassan's compound was the most challenging phase of an operation that had already tested Jessica's capabilities beyond anything she'd previously experienced. The elimination of Hassan had triggered security responses throughout the compound, with remaining defenders conducting systematic searches for the infiltrator who had accomplished the impossible. Jessica's escape required fighting her way through defensive positions while carrying Hassan's severed head and chemical weapons intelligence that justified every risk she'd taken. The running battle through Hassan's fortress drew on every tactical skill Jessica had developed during her military career, from close-quarters combat techniques learned during boxing training to advanced demolition skills acquired during special operations preparation. Her route to the extraction point required clearing multiple defensive positions while avoiding areas where chemical weapons residue created contamination risks that could have been fatal even with protective equipment. Jessica's emergence from the compound into the pre-dawn darkness marked the successful completion of a mission that senior military leaders had considered impossible. The proof of Hassan's death that she carried would eliminate the most dangerous terrorist threat to American security, while the intelligence materials she'd secured would prevent future attacks that could have resulted in mass casualties on American soil. The helicopter extraction was conducted under fire from remaining compound defenders who were determined to prevent the American operative from escaping with proof of their leader's death. Jessica's final combat actions of the mission involved providing covering fire for the extraction aircraft while ensuring that Hassan's head and the captured intelligence reached safety regardless of her own survival. As the extraction helicopter climbed away from Hassan's destroyed compound, Jessica reflected on the journey that had brought her from the streets of Detroit to the most successful special operations mission in American military history. Every challenge she'd faced, every skill she'd developed, and every limitation she'd overcome had been preparation for an operation that proved determination and training could overcome any obstacle when applied with sufficient courage and intelligence. The return to the Pentagon briefing room where the mission had been authorized felt surreal after the intensity of combat operations in Hassan's fortress. Jessica's presentation of Hassan's severed head to the officials who had authorized her suicide mission created a moment of stunned silence that acknowledged both the successful completion of an impossible objective and the extraordinary capabilities of the operator who had achieved it. "Ladies and gentlemen," General Hayes announced to the assembled officials, "Sergeant Major Crawford has successfully eliminated Khalil Hassan, rescued all 12 hostages, and secured chemical weapons intelligence that will prevent attacks on American cities. She has accomplished something that our best tactical analysis indicated was impossible, proving once again that individual excellence can overcome any challenge when properly applied." The recognition that followed Jessica's successful completion of the Hassan mission established her as the most decorated special operations soldier in American military history, but more importantly, it validated her lifelong belief that limitations existed only in the minds of people who accepted defeat rather than fighting for victory. The girl from Detroit who had learned to fight on the streets had become a soldier who could accomplish missions that others considered beyond human capability. Jessica's story had become legend within the special operations community, inspiring a new generation of warriors who understood that impossible was just another word for something that hadn't been done yet. Her transformation from street fighter to elite operator proved that background and circumstances mattered less than determination and the willingness to push beyond accepted limitations. The severed head of Khalil Hassan remained in a classified storage facility where it served as proof that even the most sophisticated terrorist organizations were vulnerable to operators who possessed the right combination of skills, courage, and absolute determination to succeed. Jessica Crawford had proven that when America's most dangerous enemies believed they were untouchable, they had simply never encountered someone willing to do whatever was necessary to prove them wrong. As Jessica prepared for her next assignment, she understood that the Hassan mission had established a new standard for special operations excellence that would influence American military capabilities for generations to come. The impossible had become possible through the application of individual skill and determination, proving that the right person with the right training could accomplish objectives that conventional military analysis considered beyond reach. The legend of the operator who had accepted a suicide mission and returned with her enemy's head would inspire countless others to push beyond their perceived limitations, carrying forward the understanding that exceptional individuals could achieve extraordinary results when they refused to accept that anything was truly impossible. The immediate aftermath of the Hassan mission thrust Jessica into a world of classified debriefings and strategic planning sessions that operated at the highest levels of American national security. The intelligence material she had recovered from Hassan's compound revealed a network of terrorist cells that extended across 3 continents, with planned attacks that would have dwarfed any previous terrorist operation in scope and casualties. Her single mission had not only eliminated a primary threat, but had also provided information that would prevent dozens of future attacks. Secretary of Defense William Thompson personally conducted Jessica's initial debrief, recognizing that her first-hand observations of Hassan's operation contained intelligence that couldn't be obtained through conventional surveillance or captured documents. The tactical innovations Hassan had implemented, the psychological profiles of his key lieutenants, and the operational security measures that had protected his organization for years were all details that existed only in Jessica's memory and experience. Crawford, Secretary Thompson said during one of their classified sessions, "What you witnessed inside that compound represents the most sophisticated terrorist organization we've ever encountered. Hassan's methods for recruiting, training, and deploying operatives were years ahead of anything our intelligence community had identified. Your observations will reshape how we approach counterterrorism operations globally." The psychological evaluation that followed Jessica's return was more comprehensive than anything she had experienced during her military career. Dr. Rebecca Foster, a specialist in post-traumatic stress among special operations personnel, conducted assessments that were designed to identify potential long-term effects of missions that pushed human capabilities beyond documented limits. The Hassan operation had required Jessica to function under stress levels that exceeded anything in the psychological literature on combat performance. The human mind isn't designed to process the kind of sustained life-or-death decision-making you experience during that mission, Dr. Foster explained during one of their sessions. Most people would have collapsed under the psychological pressure long before reaching Hassan's quarters. Your ability to maintain tactical thinking while managing multiple objectives under extreme stress represents capabilities that we need to understand better. Jessica's response to the psychological evaluation reflected her lifelong approach to challenges that others found overwhelming. "Every fight I've been in, from boxing matches to combat operations, taught me that mental toughness is more important than physical capabilities." The Hassan mission was just a longer fight with higher stakes. The principles were the same: stay calm, stick to the plan, and never give up until the objective is achieved. The strategic implications of Jessica's success extended far beyond the elimination of a single terrorist leader. Military planners began developing new operational concepts based on the proven effectiveness of properly trained and equipped individual operators against targets that conventional forces couldn't engage. The Hassan mission had demonstrated that certain objectives could be achieved more effectively through precision operations than through overwhelming force. General Hayes initiated a comprehensive review of special operations doctrine, using Jessica's mission as a case study for developing new approaches to seemingly impossible objectives. The tactical innovations Jessica had employed, from her infiltration methods to her chemical weapons containment procedures, became the foundation for training programs that would prepare future operators for similar challenges. What Crawford accomplished changes everything we thought we knew about the limits of individual operational capability, General Hayes explained to a classified gathering of special operations commanders. She proved that the right person with the right training and equipment can achieve strategic objectives that we previously thought required battalion-sized operations. This isn't just about one successful mission. It's about reimagining what's possible in special operations. The recognition Jessica received for the Hassan mission went beyond traditional military decorations to include honors that were rarely awarded to operational personnel. The Presidential Medal of Freedom, typically reserved for civilian achievements, was awarded in a classified ceremony that acknowledged her contribution to national security in terms usually associated with strategic leadership rather than tactical operations. President Anderson's remarks during the classified ceremony reflected the unique nature of Jessica's achievement and its implications for American military capabilities. Sergeant Major Crawford represents the absolute best of American military excellence. Her willingness to accept a mission that others considered suicidal, and her success in accomplishing objectives that conventional analysis deemed impossible, exemplifies the warrior spirit that has protected our nation throughout its history. The classified nature of Jessica's recognition meant that her achievements would never be publicly acknowledged, but within the special operations community, her story became legendary. Training facilities began using the Hassan mission as the ultimate example of what individual excellence could accomplish when properly applied. New recruits learned Jessica's tactics, studied her decision-making processes, and trained to emulate the mental toughness that had carried her through impossible circumstances. Jessica's transition from operational assignments to strategic planning roles reflected the military's recognition that her value extended beyond individual missions to include institutional knowledge that could benefit the entire special operations community. She was assigned to develop training programs, evaluate new technologies, and consult on missions that required the kind of innovative thinking she had demonstrated throughout her career. The training facility where Jessica developed her advanced operator curriculum became known informally as Crawford's School, where the most promising special operations candidates learned techniques that pushed the boundaries of human performance. Her teaching methods combined the boxing discipline of her youth with the tactical sophistication of modern special operations, creating warriors who could function effectively in situations that would overwhelm conventionally trained soldiers. The difference between good operators and great operators isn't physical capability or technical training, Jessica explained to her students during one of her advanced courses. It's the mental ability to remain calm and focused when everything around you is chaotic. You can learn techniques and memorize procedures, but you can't teach the kind of mental toughness that allows someone to function when failure means death for themselves and others. Her influence on special operations doctrine extended to international military relationships, as allied nations requested access to training programs based on Jessica's methods. The tactical innovations she had developed became standard procedures for elite units across multiple countries, spreading American military excellence through partnerships that strengthened global security cooperation. The legacy of the Hassan mission continued to influence American military capabilities years after Jessica's return to the Pentagon briefing room with the terrorist leader's severed head. New technologies were developed to support the kind of solo operations Jessica had pioneered, while recruitment and selection procedures were modified to identify candidates who possessed the psychological characteristics necessary for missions requiring exceptional individual performance. Jessica's story became required reading at military academies and war colleges, where future officers studied her career as an example of how individual excellence could achieve strategic objectives. Her journey from the streets of Detroit to the pinnacle of special operations demonstrated that background and circumstances were less important than determination and the willingness to push beyond accepted limitations. The classified archives that contained detailed records of Jessica's missions served as reference materials for military historians and tactical analysts who studied the evolution of special operations capabilities. Her methods became the foundation for doctrinal developments that would influence American military operations for decades to come, ensuring that her innovations would benefit future generations of warriors. As Jessica reflected on her career and its impact on American military capabilities, she understood that her individual achievements had contributed to something larger than personal success. The missions she had completed, the techniques she had developed, and the standards she had established would continue influencing special operations long after her own service ended. The girl from Detroit who had learned to fight on the streets had become more than just an exceptional soldier. She had become a catalyst for institutional change that elevated the entire special operations community, proving that individual excellence could create lasting improvements in national security capabilities. Her legacy would endure not just in the missions she had completed, but in the countless future operations that would benefit from the standards she had established and the possibilities she had proven achievable. The severed head of Khalil Hassan remained a symbol of what could be accomplished when exceptional individuals refused to accept limitations imposed by conventional thinking. Jessica Crawford had demonstrated that impossible was simply a challenge, waiting for someone with the right combination of skills, determination, and courage to prove that anything could be achieved when human potential was properly developed and applied. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.